what I tell them, it's like, sometimes you're like a dog chasing your tail. And you got to think with athletes, are we building this foundation on a house made of sand? How can we make sure that we are making interventions now that are going to help the sport in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where we can look back and say, wow, can you believe at some point we weren't using this? All right, here we go. Episode 5. Welcome back to the House of Genes podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Guzman, head of performance for 3x4 Genetics. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about this genes first approach, which we've continued to harp on week after week. And we're going to talk about how it connects to the system of high performance. Now, what's really important is that I think there's important categories that every athlete, coach, front office staff person needs to understand so they can best utilize a genes first approach. It's funny, this week I've talked to, athletes in 3 different realms, NFL quarterback, NBA trainer, and a soccer head of athletic training. And if you're not familiar with that, in the soccer world, athletic trainers are really around the physical prep, the rehabilitation, any sort of rehab protocol, stuff like that. And they work in tandem with the rest of the performance and medical staff. So I'm talking to these different groups, and it's interesting. The same conversations come up and up. We're trying to solve this injury, or so-and-so's performance is going down. And they start looking and grabbing at all these different things. And these guys are my close friends, so I can talk to them pretty honestly. But what I tell them, it's like, sometimes you're like a dog chasing your tail. Like, you think you have something right there, and you get a little distracted, and you go after that thing, but you just put all your eggs in that basket and say, oh, we're going to measure this thing to see some sort of improvement. And I keep asking them, well, how do you know what the root cause is? What's the root cause of what's going on here? And right away, the first thing you say is they go into theory. Well, this happened over here, this happened over here. And the context is so important. But the context is only as important as the foundation that it's built on. And I love this idea of building a really stable foundation. And you got to think with athletes, are we building this foundation on a house made of sand? Think about if weather came in, water, wind, earthquake, that sandcastle house, that's probably not going to last very long. Now think about if you built a house on a sturdier foundation, a solid slab of rock or cement or whatever it might be. Now while an earthquake might do some damage, wind and heavy weather and rain, that house is probably going to be a lot more stable than the one built on sand. And I used to be the person that I thought my house was really, really strong. I thought that what we were building for these athletes was so stable. But what happens is these non-contact injuries or these health issues would come up, and you start thinking, wait a minute, what happened to my stable house? Oh, I've got to go patch this now. I got to patch this. And you're just throwing the kitchen sink to keep this thing together. And I think, unfortunately, what's happening is a lot of these, what is your identity as a club, as an organization, as an athlete? What are you trying to build yourself around? And we get so attached to these different things that we love, these modalities, but our own curiosity cannot overtake what's best for, in this case, the athlete, the client. Just because I love running, long distance running, it doesn't mean that's going to be the most appropriate training intervention for, say, a basketball player who's playing a highly explosive game with a lot of repeated sprints. But I love running, so shouldn't that be part of the program? No, that's my own curiosity, my own passion there. And our curiosities and passions can't overtake for what's best for what's right in front of us. At our starting point, we have to have these foundations. We have to have these pillars. And one of these pillars you're going to hear me say over and over and over again is that we always have to prepare for the demand of the activity or the competition or the event that's coming. In soccer, we say we have to prepare for the match demands. So we study the match, we learn the demands, and then we break that down positionally, and we break down at the individual level. And ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to get these individuals a personalized program. Now, before we go too deep into what we're going to talk about today with these categories, there's one thing that I want to make clear that I think got kind of lost in the shuffle a little bit in the past few weeks. And it was good conversations. And basically, it's this idea that when you have genetics, you've got this perfect program. And that could not be further from the truth. Genetics is going to bring so much more personalization. It's going to bring a ton of specialization to who that person is and what they need. But it doesn't mean you've got perfection. We have to remember that these athletes, all the things they're doing, these athletes are just people in progress. We're finding them at a certain starting point, whether they're 16 years old or they're a 30-year-old, new transfer, new signing. They're just people in progress. And so we're trying to find the way that we can meet them where they're at now, start with the root cause, their genes first, and then start to figure out the puzzle pieces. If we're talking about coaches, same thing. I mean, I can remember when I had reached the 10-year mark in pro sports, and I knew that I had a good amount of experience, but I also was given good wisdom about staying humble. You know, there's always more to learn. I think about these guys. I was just talking to a friend today about Richard Branson. Richard Branson is at this conference, and he's on the stage with these up-and-coming tech guys. But Richard Branson has achieved a lot in his career. And what do you see he's doing? He's taking notes with a yellow pad and paper. This guy has already, quote-unquote, made it, but he's saying at whatever age he was at the time, there's still more for him to learn. You know, he's a human in progress. He's people in progress. And so I think we have to remember that thing is that if you're not doing a genes first approach, it doesn't mean that you're not doing a lot of the right things. It just means that this is part of your career path. You're in this process of progression to help other people. So I think that's important to know. Don't feel intimidated by this. Everything we're doing here with the House of Genes podcast is meant to educate and bridge the gap and see how can we continue to push performance together. How can we make sure that we are making interventions now that are going to help the sport in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where we can look back and say, wow, can you believe at some point we weren't using this? And now it seems so obvious, like common sense. So that's my rant on that. We're all people in progress. Don't feel intimidated by this. We're going to make sure that we are just carrying the conversation along as it goes. I'm going to grab a quick drink of water, and then we're going to jump into it. All right, Matt, how did that water chugging sound? Good? Okay, he gave me the A-okay. So you're going to get different views of this, and we're going to jump into an overhead cam on and off, but we're talking about today are the 5 gene categories that every athlete, or we can actually add to this, every athlete or coach needs to know. Now, we're always going to review this. At 3x4 Genetics, we don't just look at single SNPs. We look at pathways, and we believe that a pathway approach is so much more robust to get us to the appropriate interventions that we need. And to look at a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, a single gene in isolation, is not always the most ideal. In fact, we think that you could have completely the wrong recommendation by not looking at groups of genes. And by doing that, we want to make sure that this pathway approach of all these genes that fit into an inflammation pathway or a power pathway or a recovery pathway, that we are getting the most robust amount of evidence so that our application is really tailored to the human that we're working with. So we're going to work through that. There's 5 categories I want to look at, and some of these I'm blending a little bit together. Okay, and so category 1 we're going to talk about is injury risk. All right. So this big orange box, we're going to look at injury risk, and we're going to see how it connects to a genes first approach. So injury risk, we do this already. When we do intakes, we might do a musculoskeletal scan, right? The physical therapist is going to look down and do an orthopedic scan and see what are the hot spots, what are the pain points, what should we be looking out for. The dietitians are going to do this and look at gaps or holes in the athlete's nutrition philosophy or their nutrition behavior, whatever they're doing there. The strength and conditioning coaches are doing this. That's more my background. So we're going to see, okay, what measurements are we using to understand where there's asymmetries or maybe where there's deficiencies in strength or previous injury history, all that kind of stuff. But with a genes first approach, you want to see what is their starting point and what are they potentially susceptible to. It does not mean they're guaranteed to get injured. It's just a starting point like all those other tests. You wouldn't say because you did an FMS, your risk of injury goes up. No, the FMS is a profiling tool. The same thing with any sort of blood test. You might want to be testing an inflammation panel, but just by doing the blood lab does not mean that you're destined to have high inflammation. It is a diagnostic to give us feedback. And so I want to start with the most root cause starting place that we can, which is a genes first approach, looking at your genetics. So what are we looking at here? I want to have an understanding of their potential risks of injury when it comes to muscle tissue, bone tissue, and tendons or connective tissue, essentially. Now, when I think about a soccer player, the largest risk that we're probably seeing on a season by season basis are muscle injuries. And so that's going to be an important one for me. And if I can start with this genes first approach and understand that they have a higher risk of a muscle issue or a tendon issue, then I can be proactive in designing their program around that. So we got an athlete, we see that from muscle, bone, and tendon that they have low risk to bone and tendon issues. All right. Now that's without taking into consideration any of their injury history yet. It's just a starting point, but we see that their muscle is really high. So do a little arrow there. Muscle injury risk is high. And let's just say for the purpose of this conversation, bone and tendon is low. What are we going to do about that? Well, if you go to any coach and say, hey, I've got this athlete and I'm just telling you their muscle injury risk is high, they are going to program based off their system specific exercises or strength movements, or maybe a speed intervention, a sprint intervention to help make that muscle more robust. Are we good with that? We're filming out here in a common room, but we got someone taking a meeting right outside. If you hear them, then maybe their conversation is good. We'll find out. So that's how we're looking at the injury risk stuff. If I went to you and said, hey, this athlete has a potential risk for a tendon issue, ACL, Achilles tendon, right away, you're going to think, okay, here's the things that I already do to help make those tissues robust. And when I do that, I'm going to help reduce the chance or the likelihood of injury. That's all we're saying. So we want to start with a genes first approach. We want to know that individual's genetics so that we're being so personalized to every athlete we come to. Okay, the second thing we're going to go to, number 2, is more on the training side. Okay, power pathways, endurance pathways. What is their response to these things? Now, again, we could go through all the genes here. I don't want to do that right now, but there's these groups of SNPs that fit into our power pathway at 3x4 Genetics. And so when we understand that pathway and we understand their responsiveness to power training, it gives us a great idea of how we might program volume and intensity. Now, again, just because someone might be low power responsiveness genetically does not mean they can't dunk or be super fast or explosive. What it does mean is that that's something that's probably going to take a lot more time to elicit the same outcome that we want. So let's put them in an environment, or let's create these constraints where they have to produce those outputs, right? They have to be put in situations where they're sprinting or jumping or whatever it might be. And so we already do this, right? This is on the training side. We want our athletes to be powerful. So we might do a portion of an Olympic lift or a loaded jump or other variations in intensities of plyometrics. But by understanding their power response, we're probably going to program a little bit differently. So again, think about the stuff that we already do. We've got an athlete that comes in and the agent or the past coach or one of the athlete's buddies says, oh man, we just signed John. He's coming in. He's super explosive, right? As a strength conditioning coach or as a physical therapist or a physio, anyone that's working with the athlete, your brain's already thinking through, okay, he's super explosive. So here's kind of the programming stuff I'm going to do. Now, on the complete opposite side, you get an athlete and they're like, hey, this guy is technically super amazing. He's really gifted when he's on the ball, but not explosive at all. Not an explosive muscle in his body according to what they've seen. Again, we still want to test that because we want to figure out what is their capacity? How can we improve that capacity over time? Right? It's one thing to take where they're at in real time and understand that, and we can do the objective measures of different velocity times or a force output reading, whatever it might be. But we want to understand their genetic starting point. And when we understand that, if they're a low responder, they're a high responder to power, we can start to program more specifically that's going to help them get to that end goal, whatever we think that is, right? Let's start back. The first thing that I said is we're looking for the demands of the game. What's the demands for that individual? And then let's work backwards. So if I'm thinking through these things and I got a goalkeeper and he's a low responder to power, but I know that his entire position is heavily dependent on power output, we got to think through, are we just going to have the goalkeepers do the same thing? Typically you have 3 or 4 goalkeepers working together. Are all four going to do the same program all the time? Well, I hope not. That's not personalization. But you see it all over the world. All the keepers do the same stuff all the time. And for me, that's a huge misuse of programming. It's poor guidance for these athletes. So we want to make sure we get a little bit more personalized. Imagine if you knew that two guys were high responder to power and the other two goalkeepers were low responder to power. Well, we'd probably put them on two separate programs, or at least have two different ideas of volume and intensity that we're programming. It can be that simple. Okay, going to number 3, we've got our injury profiling, we've got our training profiling. Now we want to understand when we expose them to these training intensities, what does it look like for them to recover? And some stuff we're looking at here is post-training inflammation or oxidative stress or muscle damage. And again, from a common sense standpoint, we just know that we all respond to these things differently. How do we know that? Because since we were kids, people have been saying, oh, he just takes a while to recover. He's not very genetically gifted when it comes to recovery. Or this kid can play game after game after game. He just never seems to get tired. He can just keep going. He's got a big engine. So our parents and our coaches as kids have always been talking about genetics, but now we're just going to measure it. We're not going to guess. We're not going to make these statements that may affect these kids' behaviors, these athletes' thoughts about themselves. We're not going to identify them based on our opinion. We're going to do a test, and we're not going to guess. So let's take an example of post-training inflammation. I think it's an easy one to understand. For the most part, people understand inflammation. So we're looking at recovery, and imagine we've got, let's stick with this goalkeeper. Goalkeeper plays 90 minutes, right? They're not doing a lot of sprinting. If they are, then they're horribly out of position. But the goalkeeper is doing a lot of different power-producing outputs. They're jumping, they're diving, maybe they're making a big kick, whatever it might be. But we have an understanding of what that athlete's doing over a 90-minute period. And if we know that from all that activity, that the thing that is going to cause them the most damage from a recovery standpoint is post-training inflammation, what are things that we know that helps post-training inflammation? I guarantee so many people would say, oh, a cold plunge helps reduce inflammation. Okay, now whether we think that's the greatest thing ever or it's not so valuable, that is an intervention right there. So we're going to say to that athlete, go do a cold plunge. That's within your system of how you reduce inflammation. Or the sports nutrition coaches or the dietitians, they might say, well, hey, I've got a bunch of foods that I like to use that help reduce inflammation. And so we say, okay, with that athlete, that's probably important things they should be getting in. What are the foods that are going to help reduce inflammations? What are the foods that are going to help promote inflammation that we kind of want to stay away from, especially if they're sensitive to post-training inflammation? And so again, we're starting to build out this approach based off this simple test, this simple starting point of their genetics. That one should be pretty straightforward. And in the next episode, we're actually going to talk about how we build out this protocol over a 7-day stretch. Okay, from there, we're going to jump over here because it's kind of in the realm of nutrition, although we're not going to get there yet, is ergogenics. Okay, caffeine, creatine, what are things that you're taking that can help performance? We want to keep it legal here. That can help performance. And caffeine is one of the most widely researched ergogenics, drugs, whatever you want to call it, in the world. Okay? Now, again, if I went to a group of people and said, you're all going to have 150 milligrams of caffeine, you're going to have the same amount of caffeine, and you are all going to respond the same way, everybody would come back to me and say, are you crazy? I can drink a bunch of cups of coffee or have caffeine, it does nothing to me. Or someone's going to say, if I have more than 1 cup afternoon, then I'm going to be up all night. So again, we all know that we have different responses to caffeine. We have different genetic responses to caffeine. And so to allow athletes to experiment and pioneer with caffeine and just say, yeah, go drink whatever you normally drink. Again, as professionals, we are not guiding them in the right way. And so when they say, hey, coach, how much caffeine should I have? Right there, where is your recommendation coming from? Well, hopefully you're going to pull from some sort of research and say, hey, athletes in this population typically take this much milligrams of caffeine based on their body weight. Okay, great. But how do we know that you, Johnny, Sally, that you are going to respond in that way? Oh, well, just try it out, see what happens. Okay, I get that to a certain extent, but we don't want to be testing too many things like that where we're just unsure. One thing that's really important with the caffeine is that somebody could have a low response to caffeine, or they could have a high response. We've got to think about the after effects. How do they detox caffeine? If we do a genetic test around this, we can look at, is there an anxiety response when they take caffeine? Right? We know about performance arousal theory, and there's certain athletes that if it's in a small setting with less people watching, maybe that's more of where, they get this amped up frequency where they're like, here's where I thrive. And then we have other athletes where they want the biggest stage possible. The more people that they have, the more that they can rise to the occasion. Well, when we're doing something with caffeine, if we understand those effects and we see that someone's got a genetic high response to anxiety from caffeine, if you're going to the Champions League final or you're going to a World Cup match, is that something you really want to put on them? You might be putting them in a worse position by saying, hey, there's a lot going on. You got to be ready to go. So here's 200 milligrams of caffeine based on your body weight. And they could say, oh, it's what I've always done, or this is something new for me. Regardless, if they've got this high response to anxiety from that, do we want an anxious athlete out on the field? I would say no, we don't. So that's something that we want to test. We don't want to guess so we can get them the right answers. Okay, I belabored that point a little bit. Okay, number 5 of the gene categories that every athlete or coach should know is nutrition. Again, let's get to this point as many times as we can. We all know we respond different to different foods. All right, let's take dairy as an example. If you're in a room of 20 people, you know that some people respond fine to dairy, and some, if they have one smell of dairy, they're like, oh, my stomach hurts, I can't digest that, or I need to take a lactase enzyme to help support that. So we already know these things. And yet somehow we've got these different diet recommendations, whether it's, keto, carnivore, high carb, low carb, vegetarian, vegan, whatever it might be. We have these recommendations and they are not specific to that individual. We might go a little bit deeper and say, let's look at some blood work. But if you tested your blood at 7 a.m. that day, or you're like, oh, I'm actually going to test it at 1 p.m., that could change your results just right there. Now, blood work is super valuable. I'm not against it. You're going to have to retest it probably every 3 to 4 months, but it's constantly changing and giving an up-to-date reading depending on when you did it. But we need to have something that's stable. Let's think about back to this foundation idea. If you're building your house on a foundation of sand, it's probably not going to be very durable when the weather comes, when the injury comes, when you have a sickness, whatever it might be. But if you're building your house on a stable foundation, you're building your house on rock, slab, stone, whatever it might be, when you're doing those things, now the decisions we're making when injury comes, which is going to happen, or when illness comes, which is going to happen, your house isn't just going to knock over. And so we want to make sure that we use a genes first approach to understand what are the important responses to macros we look at. And in another episode, we'll talk about micronutrients. I still think micronutrients do not get the platform that they deserve. It's just kind of like, oh, everyone should take this supplement or everyone should get in this food because most athletes are deficient in this. But when I'm talking to an athlete, I don't want to convince them by saying this massive population is most likely deficient, so let's just give you that. Versus saying, hey, I tested your genetics. I know you as an individual, one of one. There's no one else in the world with genetics like yours. And because I know that, here's the meal plan that I'm suggesting. Here's the supplements that I'm suggesting. And I can tell you that so many athletes will respond incredibly better in their behavioral change around food and supplements if you take that approach. Because they're saying, wow, Daniel really sees me. He sees exactly what I need, and he's doing the proper due diligence to make sure he's recommending a program that was designed for me, not based off his biases, not based off of other beliefs he has about food, but looking at a test that is telling me about my root cause, my blueprint, my map, my starting point, about who I am and how I respond to all these foods and supplements, training interventions, whatever it might be. And that is the main point of what we're looking at. All right, guys, next episode, we're going to talk about how to build a genes first program over a 7-day period, a small microcycle. If you enjoy this kind of stuff, please subscribe to the channel. You might want to consider watching this other episode I did where I built an athlete's program in under 20 minutes using a genes first approach. As always, know your genes, own your destiny.